Everyone, my name is Jason Shar, and that's Tori Gable. Our topic is genetically modified foods, and if there's a need for stricter controls. Alright, just a little bit of background information. Genetically modified foods aren't necessarily a new thing. They've been around for a long, long time. Traditional plant breeding, which is you take an organism from one species and you breed it with another organism from the same species in order to get favorable results, has been going on ever since Gregor Mendel first made it popular. There are some pros and cons with this, but mainly in order to get the favorable results that you want, you have to go through a lot of generations. GM foods are a type of biotechnology. Biotechnology harnesses cellular and biomolecular processes to develop technologies and products that help improve our lives and the health of our planet. The main goal, like I said, is just changing an organism by modifying its genetic material. Plain and simple. The first staple crops with these engineered traits were first introduced in 1996. They were corn, canola, soybean, and cotton. It covered 1.7 million hectares worldwide.
Genetically modified food is very, very popular around the world. It is most popular in North America, South America, and in China. There's still controversy that exists over the world and is not very accepted in Europe. There are 50 individual products that are now genetically modified foods, and 13 of them are agricultural crops. 14 million small farms and large farms are in 25 countries and 134 million hectares. And since 2008, there's been a 9 million farmer increase of the genetically modified food crops. There definitely needs to be a stricter control on the genetically modified foods because this increases the toxins and poisons that are maintained in the food, and it is very harmful to potential human health because when you're adding the certain genes, it can increase certain toxins and everything that can harm you. In 1989, Japan's third largest manufacturing company, they had a chemical L-tryptophan, which is a common dietary supplement that killed 37 Americans, and 5,000 people were affected by a painful blood disorder, EMS. And this caused the company to pay for $2 billion worth of effects from damaged people for the bacteria, not necessarily bacteria, but the toxin that was produced in the foods because of the genetic gene in the food. There are potentially increases of food allergies in the foods, and they can use in vitro tests like immunoblotting to see if the allergen is actually from the gene that is produced and put into the food. And when they do that, they can test to see if there's too much allergic reactions going on and if it'll really affect people and their products. Higher concentrations of pesticides can really ruin the food and also the nutritional values, and it can cause people to be very painful, and their health will not be as good. It can really hurt you. Engineers splice foreign genes into a plant or microbe to leak an anti-resistant marker. With this marker, they transfer it into the gut, and it can be very hazardous to microorganisms. And so these genes really affect human health again. Farmers growing GM crops use just as many toxic pesticides as conventional farmers do, but this also increases toxicity, and this shows you that more people are using the GM toxins and everything to produce foods, and we don't know if it's safe yet. Herbicide-resistant crops will triple the broad-spectrum herbicides with over, they say, 20 years. and these crops are negatively affecting a number of insects and plants. Some of the herbicides will have insects being killed or actually speed up their growth rate, just as along with weeds and everything too that's affected around the whole area. There are some social economic hazards. The GM patents will want seeds from farmers around, and they want to have their land and have their seeds to produce these genes and produce the genetically modified foods to create more food and more supplements. So these farmers will actually lose their farms, potentially. They might lose their livelihoods and stuff like that. So it might be very, very devastating for many farmers. And there was 2 case studies that in 2003 kidneys were analyzed, and they were taken from 3 commercialized GM foods from rats, and they saw that there were lesions, toxicity, altered enzymes, and swelling. Another one was in 2009, and it showed blood and organ system data trials. Along with the rats again, it showed that there was affected liver and kidney damage, heart, adrenal, spleen, and blood cells affected.
Alright, GM crops are actually good for the environment. They diminish the need for pesticides, fertilizers, tillage, and irrigation. Enhanced pest control has led to less pesticides being used on their plants. GM crops will actually naturally produce a pesticide rather than humans having to go in and intervene and actually spray pesticides on their plants. Most of the major agricultural plants take nitrogen from the soil. Legumes take nitrogen from the air. There have been some studies that have tried to transfer this trait into major staple crops to thus improve the nutritional value of the soil. Tillage is common practice used to control weeds. Carbon storage is best under no-tilling conditions, which a lot of GM plants are in fact accustomed to. It needs to be noted that there's a lot of benefit and risk that needs to be weighed in when considering no-till plants, however. Irrigation, they have actually produced drought-tolerant crops made from genes of cacti and other drought-tolerant plants, so that less water is needed and therefore less human intervention is needed. GM crops and human health. As I recently just said, GM crops reduce the need for spraying pesticides. Pesticides are extremely harmful to humans, and there are 2 ways that people can come in contact with them, and that's through occupational use and through ingestion. When you spray pesticides on a field, every part of your body has to be covered. If it's not, then the pesticide could potentially slip into your system and cause some real damage. That having plants naturally produce pesticides stops this altogether. Ingestion. Plant manufacturers will wash the pesticide off of their plants. However, they don't do a thorough enough job, and there are reports of people actually becoming very ill because the pesticides are getting into their system. As recently said, GM plants will not do that because it's a natural process, it's not a foreign substance. Improving the nutritional value of certain foods, such as golden rice. I'm sure everybody has heard the term before. If you haven't, vitamin A deficiency affects over 250,000 to 500,000 children every single year. Golden rice is a vitamin A enriched rice that was produced solely for that purpose, to try and combat that deficiency. Some other useful sources of it would be edible vaccines. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and soybeans have all been genetically modified to produce vaccines. There's also an ongoing research that aims at a potato-based vaccine for hepatitis. Now, why is this so good? Well, for one thing, no more needles, which means that my hand doesn't get broken every time my friend needs to go get a vaccine. Another good thing is that harmful diseases such as HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis will be drastically reduced because needles aren't being used anymore, which means there's no potential for the disease to spread. Some staple foods, such as peanuts, contain harmful or toxic chemicals to the person allergic to it that could cause allergies or food intolerances. Biotechnology can actually eliminate these toxins and harmful substances so that certain people, such as my sister, could have peanut butter for the first time in their lives. Alright, some economic impacts. They found that GM foods had a favorable effect on the economy of whichever farmer produced them. The reason for this is because they could produce lower crops at a higher yield, which means you could plant 1 acre of crops but have a yield that is 5 acres. This has been shown in both developed, such as our country, and developing countries such as India and China. Well, India. It's shown more in developing countries, strictly for the greater crop yield and the fact that there's less pesticide being used, and among other things. Alright, some behaviors towards GM crops. Generally, they're very, very negative, strictly because a lot of people don't know that much about them. Trends show that the more people know about GM crops, the more questions they ask. The more questions they ask, the more comfortable they become with the GM crops. A particularly interesting trend showed that consumers will most likely trust the person actually going out and buying their groceries over scientists, government officials, and the like. In order for GM crops to have a stable future, there needs to be greater trust in valid sources, both positive and negative sources. You can't just go up to some random Joe off the street and say, "Give me your opinion of GM foods." That won't work. And the last point is, though GM seeds tend to cost a lot more, farmers, when given adequate information from valid sources, are more likely to buy them because less intervention by them and a higher yield. Alright, in conclusion, breeding will continue to be a major tool in the agricultural industry.
Consumers should be well aware of what they're consuming, and they should be well informed of valid sources, and further research should be done to ensure the safety of genetically modified